Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, matir asurim. Praise are you, God, who frees those held in captivity. I remember when my wife Andrea and I were living in Jerusalem in 2007 and 2008. We were living in Katamon, where the neighborhood in Jerusalem where most English speakers tend to live. And whenever we'd walk, we were living actually on Rehov Kaftet Ben-November, named after the date of the UN partition plan. And whenever we'd walk up that street to the Midrachov to get to the center of Jerusalem, downtown Jerusalem, we'd always walk through the part of that street where the Prime Minister's residence was. And out front of the Prime Minister's residence, the entire time that we lived there, were two tents. One tent was where Gilad Shalit's family lived permanently. Extended relatives of his family would live there. And the other tent was a constant flow of those whose family members were victims of terror attacks. These two tents side by side in front of the Prime Minister's residence. For those who may not know, right, Gilad Shalit was a soldier of the IDF who was taken captive through a tunnel where Hamas terrorists came up through that tunnel, took him captive in Gaza in June of 2006. This was going on, so in 2007, 2008, he was eventually freed over 5 years later. In exchange for him, 1,000 prisoners were freed, one of whom was Yahya Sinwar, who was the terrorist mastermind behind the October 7th attack. And I remember walking past the residence every day. Right there's an entry. Most people use it as a cut-through, but there were guards, gates letting you through each and every day, and seeing these two tents simultaneously yelling at the Prime Minister. When we first moved there, Ehud Olmert was the Prime Minister. By the time we left, Benjamin Netanyahu was the Prime Minister. The first of, it seems like, dozens of elections since that he's been a part of. And they would take turns yelling at the Prime Minister and yelling at each other. Gilad Shalit's family yelling, saying, "You promised us that you'd do whatever necessary to bring our child home." And these families who were mourning, a permanent state of mourning for their loved ones, victims of terror, saying, "You promised us justice, that you do whatever it takes to make sure those who killed our family members wouldn't be free." I've been thinking of that moment, that block with these two tents for weeks, especially over the past few days as this temporary ceasefire was being negotiated and terms were going back and forth between how many hostages that Hamas had in captivity would be set free, how many Palestinian prisoners would be released, some of whom children in prison for throwing stones at soldiers, some of whom attempted murder, tried to stab soldiers. And there were these debates on news, because that's really what news has become, just people yelling at each other and debating about the value of life. How is it possible, one news outlet said, that it was 150 Palestinian prisoners for 50 civilian hostages? So what the original terms of the deal were announced were. And another news broadcast said, it's not enough. And another news broadcast said, we can't negotiate anything until all hostages are returned home. I don't know. I know that I couldn't stop crying watching the news yesterday and seeing this child, Ohad Munder, who's 9, hugging his father for the first time in 6 weeks. I know that in psychological warfare, one of the hostages who were released, Hana Katsir, who's 77, and finally free, was announced by Hamas 3 days ago that she had been killed by an Israeli airstrike, but she was alive and was released. I know that Mayan Zin, one of the mothers whose children are held in captivity, I follow her on social media, and the sorrow in her voice when she released a video about hearing from the government that it wasn't her children who would be freed yesterday, but also the relief in her voice that another parent would have their children be brought home. So I don't know what it means when news debates the value of life and negotiation to bring those held in captivity home. You know, I've been quoting for weeks this teaching from Rambam, from Maimonides, who says that Pidyon Shvuim, the redeeming of captives, is so important, that it's so essential that everybody is required to participate in this mitzvah, that if we don't do all that we can to bring people who are held in captivity home, then we are liable for their captivity. Then it's on us. But I've intentionally actually avoided the second half of his teaching. Because disturbingly, Rambam also says, well, we do all that we can to redeem somebody for the sake of tikkun olam. We must not misjudge their value. Out of fear that there will be this constant state of kidnapping people in order to get what people want. It speaks volumes to the fear that Rambam must have lived in, although he lived in, compared to other points in Jewish history, a peaceful time in Cordoba where Jews and Muslims were living side by side with each other, but the idea that he would stipulate to not overpay for life, whatever that means, how do you judge the value of life? The value of life when it says in Bava Batra that Pidyon Shvuim, that redeeming of captives, is a mitzvah Rabbi, is the most important and essential mitzvah. It says that being held in captivity is worse than murder. I don't know what it means to judge one's value. But I know when you love someone, you would give everything and anything to free them. I think of our Torah reading this morning. Think of Jacob, who was so in love with Rachel that he committed to working 7 years for her. Face value, it seems kind of absurd. Committing to servitude for 7 years to marry somebody, and then when he ends up marrying Leah before Rachel, he commits to another 7 years, 14 years. 14 years for love. And I think about that, trying to value life when life is priceless, when we would do whatever we can to bring back our own loved ones to safety. And we hope and pray the same will be true for those who are not yet home safe. I was discussing yesterday, how is it that these 12 Israeli hostages, 10 Thai workers, 1 Filipino worker, who were released? Why these hostages yesterday? And who will be released, God willing, today, God willing, tomorrow, and the next day? I don't know. And I'm not sure how much say or influence Israel has in that either, but I know that when we talk about value of life, and we're told that we must do all that we can to free those imprisoned, I think about working for the sake of love. I think about fighting for the sake of love. I think about redeeming for the sake of love. Saying that blessing yesterday, watching the news, seeing these hostages return home. It was a relief and a gut punch at the same time. A relief for those whose loved ones are free, a gut punch for those whose loved ones are not. And it's a cruel game of terrorism and a cruel game of war. But I pray that, not knowing how the days or weeks or months will play out, I pray that we'll be able to say this blessing time and time again. Not just our morning prayers as we did this morning and sometimes take it for granted among other blessings of Thanksgiving, but say it and mean it. Say it because we truly understand and appreciate that the value of each life is priceless. Amen.